Shridi with us from Rajasthan. She's a very renowned scholar on ecological consciousness and what are the practices in the literary theories, novels across the globe. So, looking forward to ma'am. I want to know from you that how you see the importance of literature in our daily lives.
Okay, thank you, Pavan sir, for your wonderful question. Um, it's indeed an honor to be here. I'm very grateful to Surendra sir, to Vipin Rathod sir, and to Saint College for having invited me and my sister here for this FDP 7-day FDP program in this beautiful Tirthan Valley. We have this gurgling Tirthan river flowing right behind us, and nothing next to nature to make you feel happy. जैसे मैं अभी आपको बता रही थी, सुकून मिलता है आपको जब आप प्रकृति के करीब होते हैं. And what is literature? Literature reflects what is happening in human lives. So literature becomes important because it mirrors what is happening in your everyday day-to-day life, in the societal environment that you inhabit. But literature is also important because it humanizes you. So humanities and literature play a very pivotal role in your life because science is what is rational. You always look for evidence to prove that something is right or wrong or acceptable or not acceptable. Literature gives the human touch to human lives. That is why literature is very, very important. So you have drama, you have poetry, you have essays, you have novels, you have memoirs, you have autobiographies, you have biographies. It's a huge gamut of human experiences and vicissitudes that literature reflects and echoes. Now when you're talking about literature and ecological consciousness, so we have what you call a theory of we call it eco-critical theory. It has many dimensions now. So eco-critical theory actually, or eco-criticism as we call it, studies the relationship between environment and literature as to how any literary narratives, they depict the environment and the problems related to the environment. So this is what literature does. And Amitav Ghosh, our well-known writer, he's an iconic writer. He came out with a beautiful book on climate change and the unthinkable. And the title is The Great Derangement. The subtitle is Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And he very categorically states there that it is now the onus of people from literature to reflect the problems of environmental crisis in the Anthropocene. And we all know that mankind now has become a very strong geological force, and this force that is part of the Holocene era, according to the geological epochs, is now termed the Anthropocene, because mankind has ushered in such radical changes in the environment and the resultant environmental crises that mankind itself now has become a geologic force, just like plate tectonics and other geological changes that happen within the core of the earth. So literature, if it can reflect the environmental issues that humanity is facing at the moment, then we have very strong narratives that can give a lot of impetus to the study of what you call eco-criticism. Now you take up any nature poetry from the age of the Romantics. You have Wordsworth, you have Keats, you have Shelley, you have Byron, even up to the Victorian era, Tennyson. In the Americas, you have Whitman and Frost and Emily Dickinson. In the background of any narrative, nature is an indelible part. You cannot separate any literary narrative from nature, because man is born of nature, man survives in nature, and man ultimately goes back to nature, like the poet said, dust thou to dust returneth. So we are part and parcel of this nature. And when we take up green studies, there was this term green studies for ecosystem. Green studies is related to anything, any poetry, any novel, any drama, but the more emphasis was on the poetry of the Romantic era. So green studies became very, very important because it delved deep into how man was related to nature. And nature, according to Wordsworth, is a figure that brings solace to humanity. And throughout his poems, whether it's Tinta Nebe or Ode to Intimations of Immortality or the Prelude, Prelude is his development from childhood till his maturity. He has always found himself connected to nature. There was this poem, The Stolen Boat, in which he, as a young boy, steals a boat and rows across a lake, and then he sees the mountain, which from far was very fascinating, suddenly looming like a black, what you call this huge edifice, and he is scared, and he comes back, moors the boat again, and for days together he keeps dreaming of the mountain, and that generates a sort of an awe in him. Like in The Tables Turned also, he says that we should go back to nature to learn, because nature is the teacher. So for Wordsworth, nature was the teacher. Like he speaks about a field of daffodils where he's wandering, like a cloud. See, I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the stream, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So we are also sitting next to a stream. And the last stanza is, see how he connects his sukoon, his peace of mind, his tranquility to Mother Nature. He says, for often when on my couch I lie, he uses the word off, not often, in vacant or in pensive mood. Pensive is a tension mood. They flash before that inward eye, the daffodils. Inward eye is your imagination, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. And even when he is in the cities, in the urban life, when the sad music of humanity, he uses this word, the still sad music of humanity, it assails him, it disturbs him. Again he goes back to Mother Nature, which brings him tranquility, which brings him peace of mind. So, like he also in Tables Turned says, it's a beautiful, these lines are very beautiful. He says, one impulse from the vernal wood, vernal is green, forest. One impulse from the vernal wood can teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. See, all the philosophers in life cannot teach you how to live life ethically or in the moral way, but one impulse from the greenery around you teaches you the moral in life. So this has been like how nature has been worshipped by the Romantic poets. Wordsworth personally happens to be, my favorite. Of course, Keats also talks about Ode to a Nightingale, where he wants to fly in the middle of the night. Keats, actually, John Keats, died at the age of 24 of tuberculosis. He knew that he was going to die. He gave some of the most lyrical and most beautiful poetry to literature. And he is sitting in the middle of the night at his casement, the window. And there is this wood outside, the forest outside. And he hears a nightingale singing. So he writes an ode to the nightingale. Ode is a poem which is addressed to what you call natural objects or abstract concepts, and it is written in a very, very lofty idea. The language is very lofty. So ode to a nightingale is, he says, far, far away into the darkness, he just wants to become a nightingale and fly away with this nightingale, again away from the cares and sad, lot of humanity. And then he imagines that he is there in the darkness and there are so many flowers at his feet, and he wants to sing and be free and soar in the skies like the nightingale. So that's a beautiful poem. Again, like you have Keats' Ode to Autumn, which is about the season autumn. He personifies it. Again, it's a beautiful description of nature. Similarly, you have Tennyson, you have Shelley. So these poets, they brought out that the human emotions, human vicissitudes, and how healing takes place when you are next to Mother Nature. So this is how green studies, they develop, and over a period of time when eco-criticism became a part and parcel of the syllabi in the departments all the world over, there was a huge, rush, you can say. People were picking up, narratives for looking for eco-criticism, the innate interconnectedness between man and environment into plays, into dramas, in novels, in poems, of course. So this is how, a lot of research also came in as to how literature and environment are connected. And then, of course, ecofeminism came in. So ecofeminism was a study of how eco-criticism delves into or trespasses into the territory of gender studies, and how females and Mother Earth are related both as nurturers and preservers, and both being subjugated by what you call the male patriarchy. Even the frontier novels in the US, James Fenimore Cooper is there. So even the frontier novels, they were taken up by researchers to study as to how nature, became an object to be conquered by these people who were moving towards the west and taking up the land, from the natives. And Fenimore Cooper, even his daughter Susan Fenimore Cooper, has written a lot about frontier novels. Then environmental humanities comes in. So how humanities can relate to environment? So you have media studies, you have fine art where environment is studies as the background, you have urban scapes where the environment of the urban cities is studied. You even have the concept of eco-masculinity, where you have the ethics of care for Mother Nature, not only on the part of women, we have already done that in ecofeminism, but also how males are connected to Mother Nature, and the ethics of care as reflected in a very, very hegemonic masculine society. That is also there. I had given, I guess, a lecture during an FDP on environmental humanities. So it delves into geology, rock formations, it delves into anthropology, it delves into spiritualism, it delves into what you call classical drama, to find out as to how environment science or ecologism is related to so many different areas. Even fine art, how painters study the environment, particularly landscape artists or impressionists, how they take up, like if you go to the west, in Italy I came across some wonderful landscapes, and in England you have this landscape painter, Joseph Turner. His landscapes are very, very famous. So when you take up the eco-critical study of such paintings, nature is the backdrop, and how the painter could capture the beauty with his aesthetic sense to reflect that in his paintings. Sunsets are there, rivers are there, sunrise is there, boats on the oceans are there, trees are there, forests are there, mountains are there, snow-covered peaks are there. And it's so very interesting that human aesthetic sense is so highly developed that it's able to appreciate what is the beautiful in nature. Nature is never ugly at any point of time, unless nature retaliates, in the form of maybe floods or volcanic eruptions. then we realize that we can never conquer nature. So
Like when Kalidas wrote, he's calling cloud, go to my
Meghadutam.
and
Yeah.
Meghadutam.
Yeah.
And all other writers from Bhartrihari to Kumar Sambhav to Anand Kumar.
Right.
Because in present day, I think the kind of environmentalism we are following, that is coming from the west,
Yeah.
and the tradition from the east or the south. How do you see they are coming up, and what are the academic debates between the east and west?
Okay, thank you for your questions, Pavanji. See, we can never say that nature studies comes from the west. Of course, the theories were taken up by the Westerners, but if you go back to our roots, just excuse myself. Where did a student go to study? Where did he go to? For the Gurukul, after the Upanayan Sanskar. See, all sanskars are so important. We have 16 sanskars in Indian culture. All sanskars are what you call rites of passage. That is, from at one particular age, you cross the threshold over into another, what you call aspect of life through that sanskar. So you have the Garbhadhan sanskar, and then the Namkaran, and then the Punsavan. And Upanayan is the sanskar when a child goes to the Gurukul, takes permission from his parents, so he can go and pursue his studies. And these studies were not in institutions, they were in Gurukuls, which were part of the ashrams which were based in the forest areas. So nature was never separate from student life, and their life was so humble that they would go and beg for alms from the homes in the forest area, and the Gurukul would survive on those bhiksha given by the dwellers in that area. And life was very simple, but the topics that were taught, the subjects that were taught were so deep in their processes, philosophical, reflective, normative, giving you direction and guidance as to how to lead a complete holistic life as a human being. See, we have the concept of Jive Mahasharadah Shatam. I should live for 100 years. So how am I going to live those 100 years was taught to those students in a region or an area which was the Gurukul, that is surrounded by natural beauty. So there was no artificiality of concrete jungles, And then if you take up literature, like if you take up Kalidas, Abhigyan Shakuntalam, there is this beautiful description in the first act itself that Dushyant is hunting, following a stag. And he is about to shoot his arrow when the stag enters the sacred premises of an ashram. So now, the description is the stag is looking behind, in fear. His eyes are all dilated and all that, and kulanche bhar raha hai wo. And the moment the stag enters the ashram, Dushyant brings himself to a full stop. This is a sacred, sacrosanct region of a rishi where hunting is prohibited. So I cannot hunt the deer here and kill it. See, I had read a paper on this at Vanasthali University. Forest as a space of metamorphosis in Abhigyan Shakuntalam and Shakespeare's As You Like It, where again there is this king who usurps the throne of his elder brother, sends his elder brother into exile, and the duke, that is Duke Senior, and this king Antonio or Alonso, I forget the name. So the Duke's daughter Rosalind and his daughter Celia are good friends. And both these daughters, they follow the senior Duke to the forest. And when Alonso comes there, along with Sebastian and there is one more, Antonio, I guess that's the name. The forest brings such changes in their mindset that he realizes that he has committed a crime in usurping the throne of Duke Senior, and then he gives back the throne to the Duke, his elder brother. And then of course the play has so many acts, and the love story between Rosalind and the hero, it develops in the play. So again, the forest, the wood becomes a space of metamorphosis. It becomes a catalyst to bring about a change in the thought processes of a very greedy person, makes him realize that he has committed a crime and a sin against his own brother, and that change, that transformation of change in his thought, that he has to give back the kingdom to his brother, is what, you know, the role that nature plays in bringing about that change, that transformation. So I presented this paper, and in Abhigyan Shakuntalam, interestingly you'll find Priyamvada and Shakuntala, they are talking, and Priyamvada tells Shakuntala, you will never, eat before you water the creepers and the trees, and before you feed the deer in the ashram, the fawn in the ashram. And Shakuntala says yes. So much is her connect to the biotic environment that she doesn't eat a morsel before she has watered the trees and the creepers in the ashram, and before she has fed the small fawns and animals in the ashram. So this is the connect that Kalidas shows in Abhigyan Shakuntala. And then of course Meghdutam is there, the cloud messenger, where the Yaksh, in Alkapuri, he is separated from his wife. So the Viraha Vyatha is there. So he is actually now expressing his Viraha, this longing for his wife, this loneliness, this separation. And then he makes the cloud a messenger, and he says that you take my message, mera sandesa leke aap meri patni tak jaiye. And then of course there's a beautiful geographical description about how the cloud floats from Alkapuri to where the Yaksha's wife is living. So, and then interestingly, Shelley's beautiful poem To a Cloud is there. Then Sumitra Nandan Pant again has written a beautiful poem on Badal, because Pantji lived in Uttarakhand, in Nainital. So he has also written some very, very interesting nature poems. Of course, I have not been able to do a comparative study, which is in the pipeline, maybe over a couple of years down the lane. So nature has always been part and parcel of what you call the Indian ethos, because if you look at even our households, the first thing that we were taught, or our mothers used to do, was to ask Mother Earth for forgiveness before they would treat on her after they get up in the morning. Then giving the arghya, the oblation to Surya, was a part and parcel of our everyday lives. Worshipping Tulsi, giving roti to Gai, to Kiri Nagara Sichna, to the worship of different deities in different teas, whether it is the Vatuvraksh or the people Purnima is there. Ganga Dashara abhi gaya 4 दिन पहले, right? दशमी पे गंगा दशहरा. So गंगा लहरी भी है. गंगा के बहुत सारे स्तुति और स्तोत्र जो है मेरे पास है, मेरी एक जो प्रेयर की किताब है उसमें. यमुना पे भी है. तो हमारी ईथोस का एक, जिसको कहना चाहिए, इनसेपरेबल हिस्सा रहा है प्रकृति. वी कैन नॉट सर्वाइव विदाउट प्रकृति. Deep Ecology by Arne Naess, he's a Norwegian philosopher, where he wants humanity, to stop all this rampant consumeristic, hubristic attitude and connect to nature as a steward. Like Aldo Leopold also says, in what you call, a St. County Almanac, that we are not the conquerors of nature, we are citizens of Mother Nature, as every other thing in the biotic environment is. Shallow ecology, of course, focuses on how we can live through sustenance. Sustainability has become a buzzword in environmental studies now. But deep ecology goes even beyond that. They say no, even mankind can survive on just the basic rudimentary things in life without destroying nature. So there are so many dimensions, like you have Buddhist economics, which was given by Ernst Schumacher, where he says the right kind of living and livelihood can solve our environmental problems.